Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here with you. This is Joyce Davis, and I'm the president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And this is going to be our last great decisions discussion of 2026. We have had quite a season examining some of the most pressing topics that are facing our world today. And thanks very much to the Foreign Policy Association for basically producing these short mini master classes that have allowed us to learn more, but also to share our own thoughts. Today, we are going to be talking about a most difficult topic, one that involves the future of human rights and international law. It's so important that we try to figure out just where the world stands now and in the future with regard to protecting vulnerable people and ensuring that all countries fall under international law and order. To lead our discussion, we've asked one of our former board members of the World Affairs Councils of America, and I'll give you a fuller description, but he's also a research professor at the Center for Strategic Leadership, and he is at the U.S. Army War College as a professor. He's a lot of things, but Dr. José de Arimateia da Cruz will be with us to lead the discussion. And but for now, we will watch the video produced by the Foreign Policy Association. When that is done, I'll come back and give Dr. Da Cruz the introduction. Mary, take it away.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry, 1 second, everyone.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. We wrap things up for 2026 with a lecture on human rights and international law. Human rights date back to the 6th century before Christ with the Cyrus cylinder. It was ordered by Cyrus the Great, who founded the Persian Empire, and embedded within that text, we find provisions for respect for people, tolerance on religious levels. The Magna Carta of the 13th century and the American Declaration of 1776. These are all examples of where individuals, groups of individuals decide that people are created equal. They must be treated with respect. These are the seedbeds of modern international human rights. And in many ways, these civil liberties that were created by governments became the blueprint for what would become international agreements on human rights. The age of human rights is relatively new. It dates only to the end of the Second World War. The UN Charter has very specific provisions and statements about inalienable individual rights. In 1948, one of the most important human rights documents was drafted. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And over the course of the next several decades, a number of international agreements, treaties, conventions were drafted and entered into force. Beautiful lady here is Eleanor Roosevelt, America's first lady during the FDR administration.
Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world.
She is oftentimes considered the mother of modern human rights. She promoted them, she lobbied on their behalf, and she became the voice, the face, and the spirit of the American human rights movement. During her time, optimism was extremely high that all of these human rights agreements would lead to something tangible and meaningful, but over the course of time, there was a significant decline in global optimism about the impact of human rights instruments. So why the disconnect? Why are we drafting all of these treaties, aspiring to something truly great, and then finding ourselves disappointed in the aftermath? Well, it's a lot easier said than done, no doubt. An aspiration is very different from reality. There is the obstacle of sovereign equality. The nation-state system, which of course was established in 1500, verified in 1648, and really the dominant feature of world politics for the last 500 years is that each individual state is equal and sovereign. They determine what happens inside their boundaries. International agreements and international laws are about international behavior, whether it's trade, diplomacy, or armed conflict. And then finally, the leading state of the international system, the United States, has lagged behind in basic elements such as ratification, but it also has not always been a consistent voice for the promotion of international human rights. So what's specific about U.S. policy have critics pointed to? Human rights have never been a priority for the United States, and that's a result of realpolitik thinking. It's looking at the world through Manchian power spectacles. Take, for example, South Africa. This is the old South African map before the apartheid regime collapsed and was replaced by democracy and majority rule. South Africa was an ally despite having a racist or fascist government. It occupied areas that were not its own, for example, Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, and it produced nuclear weapons, something I didn't talk about in the lecture on nuclear arms, but in the 1970s there was a nuclear explosion, and South Africa entered the nuclear club. We believe it had an arsenal of about 6 weapons. They were done away with when Nelson Mandela came to power. But South Africa, despite all of these negatives, was a key American ally during the Cold War because it was anti-communist, it was pro-West, and it had a lot of minerals and resources that were important for America's military and our industry. So in other words, we're downplaying human rights, focusing more on strategic and economic interest. You can see here Mr. Nixon with the leader of Indonesia. They met and a green light was given for Indonesia's activities in East Timor. We were gravely concerned in the 1960s and 70s that communism would spread southward. We had lost the war in Vietnam. By 1975, the two Vietnams had been unified under the control of the Viet Cong, the communist, and there was a concern that we may not be able to hold the line now north of Indonesia. And so a small price to pay for cordial relations with the government was effectively saying, do in East Timor what you need to do. We're going to look the other way. We're not going to be concerned about human rights violations. Just Jakarta stay on America's side. And what happened in East Timor was appalling. The mass graves, the incredibly high percentage of East Timorese who died in what is now referred to as a genocide. Operation Condor, this was a CIA operation in concert with many of the countries in South America. These are all right-leaning governments, so they're fending off against leftist rebels and insurgents, activists and protesters. They formed lists of people who they would like to have arrested, and they shared those lists with other countries participating in Operation Condor. So if someone from Paraguay who is against the government flees to Brazil, to Uruguay or Argentina, those governments are on the alert to pick that individual up and return them home for some questioning. When Henry Kissinger went to Congress, not terribly long ago, he was theatrically presented with a pair of handcuffs. This is someone saying, "You so violated human rights. In places like Bangladesh, in East Timor, in South America, you really should be arrested." Author Christopher Hitchens wrote a very popular book called The Trial of Henry Kissinger, in which the whole case about human rights violations is laid out in clear text. In addition, we selectively ratify the treaties on human rights, certainly not all of them, in fact, not even a majority of them. In this color-coded map of the world, countries in dark blue have ratified 15 or more treaties, many in South America, Mexico, and Europe. Those in the lighter blue, like Canada and Russia, between 10 and 14. And then our color is orange, which means we've ratified 5 to 9 international treaties. We're lagging behind the rest of the world when it comes to ratification. And part of this is the very uncomfortable timing of the global human rights movement. It's launched in 1948. And until 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, we were still segregating bathrooms and water fountains, housing, jobs, movement, and the like. It was very difficult for us to endorse treaties that, of course, ran counter to our segregationist past. We've argued instead, look, we lead by example. We may not ratify a lot of treaties, we may not prioritize human rights for others, but we certainly prioritize civil liberties here at home, and that's exemplified by our lofty position on the Human Rights Watch List. We are a dark green, no one is greener, which means there are no human rights concerns in the United States, according to this non-governmental organization. Look at China, Russia, the Middle East, and many countries in Africa. They're either orange or red, very high on the Human Rights Watch List. Priorities for most states are not human rights. Most countries in the world prioritize security, from invasion from without, government control over population and territory, economic growth ranks very high, and then we get to the tertiary issues, the ones that are on the back burner, like climate change and human rights. The difference between climate change and human rights, however, is that increasingly it's obvious, especially to other countries, that climate change is affecting their economic growth. It's an obstacle, and that it even rises to the level of a threat to the security of the state. So while climate change is being elevated in the priority list, human rights languishes on the third tier. Well, another problem with global human rights is that it's usually based on the lowest common denominator, and that common denominator is pretty low. Here we have 6 standard countries. The civil liberties in each one of them is indicated in red. And as you'll note, some countries, like the purple one, civil liberties are a really big deal. They're very, very well protected. Where in the orange and the tan country, not so much. Their civil liberties respect is very low. And when we think about codifying an international treaty on human rights, we want as many countries on board as possible. So we start with that civil liberties commitment and then draw a line at the lowest common denominator. That is our starting point for a global treaty, that very modest common denominator. And if we want there to be broad treaty coverage of not only issues but also countries involved, we're going to draft it like this, much, much larger than the common denominator. But we can attract countries to join it by including in the wording self-enforcement. So there's not going to be an international police force, a human rights group watching you and demanding change, at least not with any authority. You're going to self-enforce all of these provisions, and you'll let us know every now and then, every 6 months, maybe every year, how well you are doing in respecting human rights. This is the human rights regime today. So there can be a great distinction between the ratification of treaties by a country and their actual human rights record. Think of Russia as an example. From the earlier map, you might note it ratifies most all human rights treaties, yet it's on the highest alert level for Human Rights Watch. So there is not a strong correlation between ratification and respect, but there are strong correlations between established democratic forms of government and respect for human rights. And by established, I mean governments that have been in business for a while. They have very clear principles established in constitutions. The newer democracies oftentimes struggle with human rights respect, and wealthy societies. You put those two together, and you've got respect for human rights. If we look at the world democracy map, countries in blue are the most democratic. Countries in red, brown, and magenta are the least democratic. All we have to do is overlay that earlier map of countries on the Human Rights Watch list to see a very strong correlation between form of government and respect for human rights. Non-democracies like Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, many countries in Africa have a very poor rating on the Human Rights Watch list. So if we really want human rights to exist in the world, we should probably stop drafting so many different human rights treaties, stop collecting all of those annual self-reported compliance ratings, and promote democracy. Democratic waves have occurred in modern history. 3 of them are indicated on this graph. The first one happens shortly after World War II. The next big run-up in democratic forms of governance after World War II, decolonization, and then finally a very big run-up begins in the post-Cold War era. So they do come in waves. There's a tendency to give back a little after each wave, but that tells us that we should be ready for the next wave of democracies. The thing of it is, not all democracies are the same, even among the established democracies of the world. There are left-leaning democratic states. They're more internationalist in their approach, and they tend to be more pro-migration. Then we have right-leaning democratic states. These are more nationalist countries, and they tend to be anti-migration. Those on the political left tend to have a stronger human rights support record as opposed to those on the political right. It's just the way the data falls out. And in Europe, we are seeing a trend line towards the political right. Countries like Poland and Hungary and Italy are very high on the pro-right side, but even the central countries of Germany and France, they're moving in that direction as well. And so much of that rightward tilt has been driven by the migrant crisis of 2015 and 16, when over 1 million people from Afghanistan, Iraq, from Syria, they flowed into Europe and overwhelmed so many of these countries. This is the president of Hungary, Mr. Orbán. He is inspecting a brand new chain link fence with razor wire to prevent migrants from entering his country. Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, she came to power on an anti-migration platform. And we can even say that Brexit was largely caused by migration concerns in the United Kingdom. The protesters were out there voicing their opinion that we're losing our country, we're losing our culture, and it's because of the European Union, which allows the free movement of people between members of that integration process, and therefore they wanted out. They would go to almost any length to do so, including electing people like Boris Johnson to lead the government and complete the task of Brexit.
Now is the time, I think, for my country, our country, the UK, to seize the opportunities of leaving the EU. We may be extricating ourselves from the treaties of the European Union. We are not leaving Europe.
And on the not too distant horizon, it appears the next leader of the UK may well be Nigel Farage, who is a fervent anti-migrant, hard-right politician and the most popular political figure in the UK today. Asylum seekers and international treaties protecting them is a very big challenge for the international community. These are individuals who have crossed international boundaries out of a well-placed fear of persecution back home, either for their race, their religion, or their politics. Once an individual reaches American shores, they must be admitted and processed if they claim asylum. They do so at the port of entry. A judicial decision will be rendered at some point in the future. They're given a date. They're told to come back to the courthouse 18 months later, when a judge will consider whether their fear of persecution back home is legitimate and compelling. They must be allowed to stay if the judge rules in their favor. This in and of itself is not highly problematic because of all of the migrants in the world, very few of them are genuine asylum seekers. The threshold is very high. Not that many can surpass it. Of all the migrants in the world, they're overwhelmingly economic migrants. They're coming for a better life. About 10% are refugees. Those are people who are forced across international boundaries because of conflict back home or government policies targeting them. Of those, a very small number are actual asylum seekers who genuinely fear for their lives due to some form of persecution they would face back home. But when they arrive at the border, every migrant knows to claim asylum because that gets them across the border. That gets them a court date 12, 18 months later to be processed. And that increases the chance that they can stay in the United States. In other words, common migrants are taking advantage of and abusing asylum privileges by claiming to be asylum seekers. That gives them entry and a long period to wait out the process. Liberties, rights, and courts are all bound up in international human rights law. Civil liberties, some countries have them. Ours happen to be quite impressive. Human rights treaties, most countries ratify them. They don't all respect them. And then institutions, many countries resist them. They are the ultimate form of intrusion on the sovereignty of a nation state to have an institution somewhere telling you what you may or may not do at home with your own citizens. The human rights institutions can be in three categories: regional courts, international courts, and what we call the Human Rights Council, which is an institution. The regional courts are ranked by how impressive and impactful they are. At the top of the food chain, without question, is the European Court of Human Rights. It sits in France, and it has purview over all members of the Council of Europe, which is about 46 countries. That means it's larger than the European Union. The regional court for our hemisphere, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, was modeled after the European one, and it was developed about 20 years later. It is not nearly as impressive, and the United States doesn't go near it. And then the newest and least impressive of regional courts is the African Court, which dates back only a decade or so. It is continuing to unfold, evolve, and develop. An international court is the ICJ, which was founded in 1945, although in reality it's a continuation of the Permanent Court of International Justice established in 1920. The court is there for nation states only. If there is a human rights dispute between two countries, the ICJ enjoys jurisdiction, but only if the two parties to the dispute provide its consent. In other words, the ICJ is there to help you if you want to use it. It doesn't force its will or its jurisdiction upon any country. Human rights topics that have been considered by the ICJ include workers' rights to strike. Are they a human right embedded in the ILO, International Labor Organization's Convention? Climate change. Do younger generations have a human right tied to the need to fight climate change? The crime of genocide, among many others. So the ICJ is one institution at the international level that can hear cases involving human rights. The same can be said about the International Criminal Court, which is much newer. It was created by the Rome Treaty of 1998. When enough countries ratified that document in 2002, the ICC came into existence. We signed the treaty in 1998. We adopted it, which means we would consider it for Senate confirmation. Then we promptly unsigned it when George W. Bush was inaugurated. I don't know either how you unsign something that you have signed. To me, is synonymous with unringing the bell or unspilling the milk. But nonetheless, we withdrew our signature. We have refused to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, and we have sanctioned its judges when cases are brought against our allies in the international system. There's also the UN Human Rights Council. It was initially a commission created by the General Assembly. We criticized it heavily because we believed violators of human rights are commonly elected to commission seats. And if they're on the inside, they're going to prevent direct criticisms against themselves. Yet the commission focused far too much on our ally, the state of Israel. So our criticisms translated into a change of the commission, and now it is the Human Rights Council. Commissions can give advice. Councils have executive authority. They are powerful. Yet what we've learned in that experience is nothing changed in the Human Rights Council. It functions basically just like the old commission did, and for that reason, the U.S. withdrew under Trump 1. We returned under Joseph Biden, and now we've already exited or withdrawn under Trump 2. Human rights, a perennial challenge in foreign affairs and world politics. Without question, the world would be a much better place if human rights were respected, genuinely applied by governments far and wide. The reality, of course, it falls far short of that. It remains a burning question: how much should we care about human rights in the construction and execution of American foreign policy? Jimmy Carter elevated it to front burner status. No other U.S. president has done so. For the most part, from John F. Kennedy to Joseph Biden, they've largely just talked the talk about the importance of human rights, but geostrategic interests have always prevailed over them. I want to thank you all for joining me for this 8-lecture masterclass. Until 2027, stay engaged and make great decisions.
Thank you for your support and for your participation.
Well, thank you so much. And as he said, make great decisions. But to help us at least think through what the issues are with regard to the future of human rights and international law, we have invited an old friend of our council, Dr. José de Arimateia da Cruz, who is a research professor at the U.S. Army War College. And he also is currently a research professor at the Center for Strategic Leadership, Homeland Defense and Security Studies, and Senior Environmental Security Fellow, Strategic Landpower Futures Group at the U.S. Army War College. He is the former president of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, and he was joined, we were sitting together for a while on the board of directors of the World Affairs Councils of America, where I got to know him a little bit better. But needless to say, I could go on and on about his bio, but we have someone who I think we will learn a lot about, and it would be very interesting to hear his perspectives on this topic. So, Dr. Da Cruz, we invite you to join us. Good to have you here.
Oh, wonderful. Great. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for this opportunity to talk to our fellow members of the council. Looking forward to this engagement. What I would like to do, with your permission.
Before we turn it over to you, I'll also let them know that a fellow moderator, Russell Goodman, I realized I hadn't invited him, will be here. He's secretary of the World Affairs Council and will join us. He's moderated several of our other forums as well. So this is your discussant group. And Mary, if you want to join us, feel free to as well.
Wonderful. That's absolutely fantastic. So let me do this, if you allow me. Let me make some observation regarding the video, and then we can open up for a discussion.
Okay.
Just good. Because the speaker mentioned a couple of things without elaborate on, like the waves, right? For example, that's an idea by Samuel Huntington in his book, The Third Wave of Democracy. So he talks about the waves. There's the first, second, and third. Right now we're in the third wave of democracy. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But let me make a couple observations. I think most of us know that when it comes to international relations, the unit of analysis is the state. So the state's the most important. You have the individual level, and the state, of course. The state's very important. And when it comes to the state, I think it was mentioned in the video, we have aspirations and we have realities, right? We would like the world to be wonderful and everything else, but the reality is we live in this Hobbesian state of nature where, not everybody's friendly towards each other. So the survival of the state takes precedent over the aspirations of promoting a just and fair society. So that's the dilemma that we face in the 21st century and beyond when we talk about human rights. And also we have to ask ourselves, whose human rights are we protecting? Right? Because we have a tendency to distinguish within our society that, the us and the others. So the us are the best thing in society. The other are the replaceables. So why should I worry about those others? So it's very important to keep that in mind when we talk about human rights. The other thing that was mentioned in the video is whenever we talk about the state, we really have to think in terms of real politics, right? Yeah. That the state's objective is always, and it was mentioned several things, security, economic growth, climate change. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But that's the priority that states are given. So it's usually driven by strategic and economic interest. So that's why we see sometimes, why is the United States a friendly, not ally, perhaps a partner with, let's say, North Korea and Russia, but then with other states, we don't communicate, we don't interact. They abuse human rights just as the other country. But why is it? Right? So we have to think, okay, what are the strategic and economic interests of the United States of America, given the fact that the protection of the sovereignty of the state and survivability of the state is priority, given that we live in this Hobbesian state of nature. So that's important to keep that in mind. And also, a lot of the atrocities committed in regards to human rights, especially after World War II, it happens to occur during that time of the world when it was a bipolar world. You had the United States and its allies, right? Implying that those countries joined the United States because they're allies. And then you had the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Satellites mean they were incorporated into the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union at the time against their will. So you had this bickering between the two superpowers. And then, of course, human rights went to the wayside because now the survivability of the state and the spread in the influence across the globe became a priority. So a lot of the treaties that they talked about in the beginning of the shows and everything else, it's well written. It's written to promote and protect human rights, but unfortunately, the survival of the state, economic interest, strategic interest comes to the forefront. Okay, there's another implied assumption in the video, and that is the author or the speaker said there's a correlation if you look at democracies and human rights. If you superimpose, well, that's great, but you have to remember that some of those so-called democracies they have a very small little d, right? Because democracy should be thought as procedural, and as the procedural aspect of democracy and the substantive aspect. What do I mean by that? The procedural aspect is, does a nation have election? It does. Okay, so they had an election. Oh, it's a democracy, right? You had Iraq. Everybody showed the little purple finger. Oh, they had an election. Well, but how about the substantive aspect? The ability of someone to earn a living, the ability of someone to have health care, security, human rights. Sometimes that's ignored. So if you look at Cuba, you could say, well, Cuba is a democracy. They have elections. Korea is a democracy. They have elections. But then when you look at the substantive aspect, then you see, no, hang on, it's not. Right? So it's very important for us to keep that in mind when we talk about democracy. Because this idea that if you are a democratic society, therefore you also protect human rights, dates back to 1795 when Immanuel Kant wrote a book called Perpetual Peace. So it's an old idea that keeps circulating, redefined. And for those of you that have read Thomas Friedman, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, he talked about the Macedonization of the world. If a country has the Golden Arch,
it's democratic.
It's a democratic, or they will not fight each other. And then you begin to hear this idea that democracies do not fight each other because, because of their economic interdependence and so forth. The fact of the matter is, democracies do go to war, but usually they don't go to war against each other. They go to war against somebody else. And if you look around the world, you see that happening as we speak.
Exactly.
So it's very important to keep that in mind. So when we talk about human rights, you often see for lack of a better word, the world superpower establishing what is or what is not human rights. So if you take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the other documents, the big superpowers are behind it. So they'll sign it. So there's enforcement, because if you take that document someplace else, and you could have, China using its economic power against smaller state in Africa, Latin America, and say, if you voted for it, then there's no direct investment for you. So you can see the point. So now you see nations around the world talking less about human rights and talking about something called responsibility to protect, or R2P. They use that acronym, the letter R, the number 2, and the letter P, all capitalized. So responsibility to protect, meaning that regardless of the country, another nation could say, we have an obligation to go in, not because we want to protect human rights, but because that government refused to do A, B, or C. Therefore, it's our responsibility as good stewards of the world to do something. So that's a concept that has been circulating around great powers, and it's been widely used at the United Nations. Of course, there's some serious implication behind that term, because that could be an excuse to invade or interfere in the internal affairs of almost every country in the world. So which ones do you pick? So that's very important to think about that, okay? It was also mentioned, this idea of the waves of democracy. Samuel Huntington wrote this book called The Third Wave, if anybody wants to read, that he talks about the 3 waves. The first one took place in 1820 to about 1920. Okay. And then, of course, there's a sort of reverse in that wave when Mussolini comes to power. And then, of course, conflict. The second wave takes place from 1943 to about 1960, when we had all those gorgeous document that they talk about a little bit ago. What do you see happen in the 1960s? You see military, bureaucratic, authoritarian regimes coming to power all over the world, but especially in Latin America or the Americas, right? Because this is where countries were really trying to establish hegemony. And then the last wave of democracy is from 1974 to the present day. 1974, this is when there was a revolution in Portugal, and they relinquished their empires. And this is really the beginning of the third wave. So this is where we are today. So to put in context. So that's the idea of human rights in a nutshell, and some of the stuff that were mentioned that I want to, because I want to make sure that I leave enough time for Q&A. So fire them away. I'm ready.
All right, I'll get started, and then Russell will join us, and then we'll see if any of our guests are sending in any questions. But I will tell you, I have so many questions, one of which we get later. How long do these waves usually last, and when do you get a sign that they're on the way out? And, that's
well, correct. There's no timeline when the waves, usually it starts when a major event takes place. Mm-hmm. And then this could last 5, 10, 20 years. And then there is a transition in which the democracy reverts to something else. It could be an authoritarian regime. It could be a socialist regime. So that's when that wave ends. And then another event could take place. And then there's a restoration of the civil rights, civil liberties, and democracy. And then the new wave begins. That's how it is established. So the waves is basically a transition from non-democratic to democratic, and the reverse will be the opposite.
Got it. And I'm assuming this is something that any country could experience.
That is correct. Any country could experience, whether it's and you see some of this happening right now in Europe.
Yeah.
Long-established democracies in which certain candidates are coming to power and doing things that you could never imagine would happen in certain society, but unfortunately it is happening. So we're beginning to see many countries around the world this, what they call the backsliding of democracy.
Yes.
It's not completely gone, because some of those leaders are coming to power through legitimate means, elections. But once they come to power, then they begin to chip away on the civil rights, civil liberties, and constitution rights of the people. So that's called democratic backsliding.
Got it. Well, I have to tell you, again, this is, I think, for many of our people who will be tuning in, it's one of the concerns that we have about what's happening even in our own country. We know that VDIM, the VDIM Institute, reported an unprecedented decline in U.S. democratic indicators. And apparently with the U.S. dropping in global rankings due to what they say.
For the first time.
Yeah, to civil liberties, polarization, and the lack of checks on executive power. That's what someone from the outside is looking at us and saying. And I have to tell you, one of the things that even most recently that impacted me, I want to write about this too at some point, how it makes the fact that the U.S. did not sign the UN, the United with the treaty, or they just passed something on condemning slavery, right? Let's see if I could find it. I had it up, but it looks like the U.S., Israel, and perhaps one other country simply did not sign that slavery is an abuse of human. I mean, that baffles me. I mean, do you have any thoughts on what could be behind the United States not signing that?
Well, and again, I'm speaking as a private individual. Sure. Okay, so let me make sure that this is very clear. I'm not speaking as on behalf of the Army War College or the U.S. government or any other agency of the government. I'm speaking as a private individual. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you sign that document, then you could be opening up yourself for some liability in lawsuits. right? And I think that's what some world leaders see. They see this as a liability. So therefore, why open up that can of worms? And the easiest way to do is not to vote or perhaps abstain. Because if you abstain, you're not admitting guilty. You're not saying yes or no. You're just saying, well, I'm not. Maybe perhaps you could say, I don't have enough evidence. I don't have enough information. Once I do, then I could make a decision. So that's my opinion on it.
Well, I can see that the U.S. leaders do not want to admit something that would cause them to have reparations or whatever, but it still sits uneasily with some people.
No, it does. It does.
Descendants of slaves, that the U.S. does not simply see this as a grievous wrong that you would do to people. But Russell, you come in here. I think you wanted to add some facts to this conversation as well.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, I just wanted to say that the tension that Jose is talking about between concerns for human rights and our national security is something that's been with this country almost since its very founding.
Correct.
I mean, when you look back at such notions as manifest destiny, obviously the government and the expansion of its control over this continent was not the least bit concerned about the rights of indigenous populations. We see that as we continued with the Monroe Doctrine. We were going to be the hegemon of this entire sphere. With our military intervention in the Philippines that got people like Mark Twain so upset. We've seen a score of interventions in Latin America. In our own time, I mean, in Grenada, in Nicaragua, in Panama, most recently, obviously, in Venezuela. And look at that. It's been very explicitly said, we're not here for regime change. We're not here, to bring democracy. This whole thing was about oil, and it's framed as national security in that we want to control whether oil is going to be sold to another hegemon, China, right? And one can make that argument, and of course, that's exactly what has been said. The intervention right now with the sanctions with Cuba, perfect example right there of our talking about our own security. It, of course, was the focus of security concerns back in the 60s when we had the missile crisis, right?
That's right.
Africa, Patrice Lumumba, and being behind the assassination, of him in the Congo. So this kind of concern for human rights is laudable, but it's always trumped, no pun intended, by our concern for national security. I guess the question then is there ever, in terms of international relations, a place for a concern for or a view that we are all in this together, that what affects humans in some part affect humans in every part? Is there any place in international diplomacy for this business about us being all wrapped up in this together, as Martin Luther King used to say? Or is that just complete naivete?
I don't think it's naivete. I think there are certain issues and concern that it could unite us together, right? I'm gonna use one example that, for me at least, should unite everybody, but there are exceptions to the rule, of course, because the hegemons. Nuclear power is a good one. Like, I mean, if you think about nuclear capability, which some countries have, I mean, what is the point of it? You could say, well, we have nuclear weapons for deterrence. Deterrence of what? If you use and I have a second capability to strike, we're all going to go down, right? But there's still, the international community seems to be concerned about that, but allows certain countries to have that weapon, that type of weapon. Another one that I think is one that we can try to ignore, but eventually we're going to have to deal with, is the environment. We can act like it doesn't impact us, but you take a look what's happening around the world. Temperatures are out of control. I just got back from Arizona about 2 weeks ago. I was there for about a week, and good Lord, 107, 106 degrees every single day. By 8 a.m. was about 90 degrees. And I thought, how can you live in this place? Yeah. Airplanes could not take off.
Wow.
You have storms. They're less frequent, but when they come with a powerful punch. And all you have to do is take a look what happened right now in Hawaii, in other parts of the country. Every single year we have fires, half of this country, floods. So it gets to a point that we're going to have to wrap our heads around and say, what can we do to address this issue? Because I think that's going to be an issue that future generations are going to really have to look into it. Because you can try to ignore, but eventually you're going to have to deal with.
You have to deal because
so Russell, I don't know if I answer your question, but I think for me, those are two of the important issues that I think we can create some kind of consensus. It's going to be hard to bring everybody aboard.
Let me just piggyback on what Jose just said. I think, if anything, Europe has certainly learned that as the Sahel continues to broil, and you see greater and greater and greater numbers of refugees who are fleeing because of climate change, that climate change is in fact a national security interest. It is not a hoax that you can afford to ignore. And all we need to do is to look at what's going on there. People who are complaining, as they are in the UK, about we're losing our country because so many immigrants, refugees are coming from wherever, set aside the issue of racism and all the rest of that. Nevertheless, you've got a lot of people coming to your shores. This is something that all of us, we're in this together. It needs to be addressed together.
No, I agree with you 100%. And again, I could use more examples of it. The Panama Canal has been closed because of the water level due to a shortage of rain. And then when it rains, it opens up. That's a major concern. The Amazon region right now, there are parts of the Amazon that have been completely dried because of the environmental changes taking place within those countries. So this is something that we're really going to have to address, because it has a tremendous impact on our national security, our ability to deploy our soldiers, the type of equipment we're going to use, the type of clothes we're going to wear, and everything else. So there's tremendous implication beyond just, protecting the environment. So.
Yeah, I also think, this lack of moving away, the world, not just the United States, but the world moving away from a focus on human rights, I think is so short-sighted. We seem to be in a world where, because I have the power, I'm not going to worry about that. But as we've seen empires rise and fall, the reason for a standard of how you treat each other is that one day I might be the vulnerable and weak country. I want there to be laws that will protect me when that time comes. I just think we're not looking at the bigger picture of everybody's survival. That sooner or later, even the United States may weaken and another country may come to the fore.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. But unfortunately, we're seeing around the world societies become so more polarized for different reasons, right? And I think that's going to be a tough sell to promote this idea of human rights when we're so polarized based on many different reasons.
Yes.
And I agree with you 100%. You know, we may be sitting at the top of the food chain today, but events like every other empire that have risen and collapsed, you know, we could be in that same situation one day. And I'm constantly remind folks that, you know, in this world that's becoming more interdependent economically, social, politically, and otherwise, you know, this idea that a country can go alone, it's a horrible idea if you even think about that. And there has been many examples in which, you know, we have said, well, you either with us or against us, and then only to come back to the floor of the United Nations and say, we need help.
Right. Well,
You know,
that's
and
my
that's
concern too. That my concern is that even today, the U.S. seems to not have strong allies anymore. And yet we're in a war that is, by all counts, going to be really nasty, especially if we have to put troops on the ground.
yeah, and I agree. I agree with you, and I think, you know, we're seeing partners and allies realizing or perhaps rethinking how they approach the United States. And some of them have, you know, are very concerned about the fact that the United States may leave them alone, or may not protect that security umbrella that we have had since the end of the Cold War or during the Cold War. And what's going to happen, right? We just and that is a concern for many countries around the world today, that the trusted partner that we had in the United States, it's slowly disappearing and relinquish its responsibility to the rest of the world. So for me, that's a serious concern.
Well, I also think, I mean, Russell, I don't know if you have any ask as we're close, but I also wonder, we had ideals in this country. We had things that actually united us and that made us, I believe, gave us power, moral power around the world. And I wonder, do you see a way that we can reclaim that? Or once you lose it, do you lose it forever? I don't know.
Well, you know, I'm a strong believer in the concept of the shining city upon the hill. Maybe call me an idealist, but I do. I think the United States, and I speak as a foreigner because I'm originally from Brazil. I speak as a foreigner who became an American, you know, who truly believe that this country has a tremendous power, you know, great values that could be an example for the rest of the world. So I think, you know, the United States can be that world leader, but there's going to have to be a lot of changes because the international community are beginning to question the United States leadership. And like you said, your credibility is like once you lose it, is extremely difficult to regain.
Yeah.
And that's the situation that we're in today. I think whoever is the next president of the United States, he or she is going to have a tremendous amount of work to do to reestablish, rebuild our alliance around the world.
Yes.
And that's a tall order.
Well, yeah, it is, because we don't know how bad it's going to get. Even we're not at the end of what many unfortunately fear is this decline, the decline in values, and maybe the decline in world leadership, clearly. And we don't know if that's going to really lead to a decline in the strength of the United States, even the military strength of the United States. So because all of it feeds into each other, right? Russell,
It does.
Go ahead.
No, I say it does, and that's my fear, that I think if the United States were to lose its position within the world community, then who is left? China?
Yes.
Russia? Are those the kind of societal values that we want to live under? You know, when I was in Brazil before I came to the United States, we had a military dictatorship, and you couldn't be standing in the corner in front of your house talking to your friends, because the police could come over and say, "Can I see your documents?" And you go, "Well, this is where I live." And then they would beat you up or take you to the police station until somebody brought your documents. And then Lord knows whether they would release you or not. So that's not the kind of society that we live under. Some people have this idea that, well, sometimes we have to give up some of our freedoms in order to have our liberty. Well, you say this until your liberties are impacted. And then you realize what kind of system you're under. Then you go, what have I done? And I don't want the United States to be that country.
Yeah, exactly. Russell, did you have a final question or a comment?
My final thought would be that we often say that we are an exceptional country. And of course, we have acted exceptionally from time to time. But I think if you look at American history overall, you see that there have been abysmal things that we have done internally. What has always been exceptional are the ideals of this country. And what our task is to do everything we can to live up to those ideals.
Yeah. And I agree with you 100%. And I think the World Affairs Councils of America, the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, the World Affairs Council of Savannah, that's what we do. We bring people to, in the spirit of learning what's happening, so we can make better educated choices and really guide the future generations. I worry about the younger generation. It's a great generation. Don't take me wrong. But I worry about the information operations that our near competitors, China and Russia, are doing on TikTok, on Instagram, and all the other garbage that's out there that they read and they assume that this is true. So I think that that's the function of our council, to do things like that, educate the population and the young people. And I think I've said this to Joyce many times, I think you guys do a tremendous job with the young people, the high school in Harrisburg and everything else. I applaud you for doing that.
Well, you are absolutely right. But part of what we do is try to nurture the next generation of world leaders. We think that is key. And I will tell you, though, just as you said, the next president may have his or her hands full. Our next generation is going to have to clean up a big mess.
Yes, they will.
That we have made. And
I hope they have the patience to do it.
Well, or the strength.
Oh, the strength. That's right.
To do it. But Dr. Da Cruz, once again, you're so generous with your time and your
anytime.
And we're about to step into in May, we bring in our college students who prepare for the high schoolers who come in June. So this summer we will have a very active summer internship program, and we'll be calling you to feed into those young minds very soon.
Anything that I can do to help, don't hesitate to call me.
Well, thank you again. And thank you all. I think we didn't give you a whole lot of good news, but we gave you lots to think about during these 8 weeks that we've done the great decisions. And the one we're closing on is one that I think we all would do well to simply stop and ponder. We must have respect for each other, for people around the world, whether they're poor or whether they're wealthy, whether they're weak or whether they're powerful. We never know when one day we might be in a situation to need human rights. So with that, thank you all, and we will see you next year for our great decisions. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Da Cruz.
Bye-bye.